Hello and welcome to our NPQSL Assessment Insights session. I'm joined today by Vanessa McDonald, Lead NPQSL Facilitator. I'll hand over to you now. You can get us started whenever you're ready, Vanessa.
Hi everybody, and as Hamish has just said, this is the NPQSL Assessment Insights session, and this is really just to give you an insight into some of the aspects to do with assessment to support you as you move forward on your journey towards that final assessment submission, and to highlight some of the key things that you need to be aware of. So initially we're going to have a quick look at the overview of the programme and what that contains and how that relates to the mark scheme and what you need to fulfil. So this first slide is a summary. By now I would hope that you have a clear understanding of how this sits together. So essentially you're assessed in the 6 content areas, and under those 6 content areas there are specified and specific assessment criterion which you will write to. It's also based on the mark scheme. Now you can find both of those in your assessment guidance, and that assessment guidance you can find on the Learning Network underneath the assessment tab if you have not already found that. Each of those criterion, as it says there, are awarded 0, 1 or 2 marks. 0 is you would have provided no evidence and your assessor can find no evidence of that criterion, which is highly unlikely as you will be writing specifically to them. The 1 and 2 marks are shown in the mark scheme, and the differences and nuances between them are in the mark scheme, so you can look at those. You must achieve a met pass mark of 20 out of 28, which means that you need to have a combination of 1s and 2s, and as it says there, if you do not get a 1 and you get a 0 in any criterion, then you cannot meet the standard, however strong your other criterion are, so just be aware of that. This next slide is really just to give you an indicator of the guidance that's available to you to support your efficient and effective assessment submission. And these documents can be found on the Learning Network on Canvas. You'll also be able to find there all the templates that you need for your final submission. Do have a look at the assessment guidance for candidates carefully, as it has all the information that you need to support your final assessment submission. So you can see the assessment handbook, there is your essential reading. It goes through everything. It contains the mark scheme. It contains the breakdown of the learn how to and learn about of each of the assessment criterion. So it really unpacks. Your project overview and tracker, if you've been doing your tracker as you've gone along, that will have built up a nice evidence base for you. And in addition, you have got some example assessment submissions, which again are on the Learning Network underneath the assessment tab. Scroll to the bottom, and I would recommend that you do open up each of them irrespective of the phase that they are, and have a look at how those successful submissions have laid out their work, what kind of writing style they have, what structure they've used, and how they've made use of the different templates to support those additional documents. And you also, just to remind you that you have those example sponsor evidence for those assessment criteria 3.2.1 and 4.2.1, which are the compulsory, if you like, the required supporting documents for NPQSL that your sponsor must complete, for which there is also a template on the Learning Network. So when we come to assessment, your assessors are going to look at these different things, the ones that are on the slides there. They do take account of the different points on the slide, and do remember those when you're looking and reviewing your writing of your project, and you do need to rigorously review it and think about whether you have each of those points. What is the relevance to the level of the qualification and its suitability? How good is the clarity of your writing? When you're looking at each of the criterion, how specific is the leadership activity to that criterion that you have undertaken? And remember, it's your leadership that you're looking at. Consider the style of your writing. And consider as well the impact of your leadership. And the impact of your leadership will be on each of the criterion, where that is relevant, but also the impact on your development of your own leadership, and that might link to the behaviours. So even though the behaviours are not formally assessed, there is still an expectation that those 7 behaviours will be woven into the way in which you are demonstrating how you have developed your own leadership. So make sure you're considering those as well as those points on the slide. Now, when we look at this, these are the characteristics of strong candidate practice that have been taken from moderations and which have been identified, and use these to really challenge and check your project task write-up. When you're preparing to write up your assessment submission, do make sure you have available that DFE mark scheme, your project tracker, and note where a criterion has a number of parts which need to be unpacked if you're going to fully respond to each of its requirements. There are 2 slides here to look at characteristics of strong practice, so we're just going to have a quick run through and not cover each of the points. You can see from point 2, make sure you've got a clear understanding of the assessment guide and mark scheme and use that to framework your submission. You might wish to use some of the language that's actually within that. Really make sure of your project overview and tracker, because that will allow you to make sure you're understanding the assessment criteria, that previous point, and it breaks down with the prompts, allowing you to really think about what the evidence is to support looking at that 2-mark response. Looking at each of the keywords in each of the assessment criterion, and keep referencing and thinking about those. And it highlights here on the slide analysis and evaluation, and I would recommend that you find at the front of the mark scheme the glossary, that is the DFE glossary linked to the mark scheme, that unpacks what they mean by analysis and evaluation, so you can see that you're actually hitting that. And I think that last point, how the criteria have been met rather than how the project was run. It isn't going to be an easy narrative. It won't flow like a narrative, the trees, and it's about looking at each of those individual criterion and considering how it's been met. So continuing on those characteristics, remember you're writing in the first person. It's about you and your leadership and the impact you've made. So often I. Really think about your writing style. It's crisp and focused. You may find that you need to be succinct in some of what you say. The references and quotations are clear. You don't have to use Harvard referencing. You just need to acknowledge the reference. So whether that's Cotter, for example, or Fullen and Boyle, you might just note that. Devote roughly the same number of words to each individual criterion. That's something we do get asked quite often. So that's roughly, there's no hard and fast rule on that, but roughly that's the guidance, roughly the same number of words. And make sure you're referencing where you're using any supporting evidence. I think that penultimate point is really important. Get somebody to really check your submission to make sure it does make sense. Utilize other colleagues or whoever at home can read through it for you. Just make sure that you've got beyond seeing the wood for the trees and they can say that, what does this mean? That doesn't make sense. And do make sure you're including that word count at the end of each section to make sure you're not exceeding it. We're going to move on to the next section, which is to look at the assessment criteria. And we're just going to have a look at one in a little bit more detail, just so you can see how somebody else has completed this. So this is a teaching and curriculum example, and the 2 marks descriptor is provided. So the material on this slide is an extract. The candidate actually wrote much more than this. But the candidate script has a number of key elements directly aligned to keywords in the assessment criteria. They reference the word techniques and then offer 3 examples of the techniques that are used. The candidate then answers the so what question, i.e. you have carried out this analysis, so what did you do with the outcomes? They tell us their analysis led to the identification of inconsistencies in assessment and to the introduction of the ECAT assessment scheme. You can see that highlighting of specific words, and you might want to spend a little bit of time just unpacking that when you've got the opportunity to see how some strong evidence, but also how they've used some of the language in the criterion. This is a kind of aid memoir, really. Really refer to your notes that you've made in your project tracker. Use this as a really good strategy to think about the prompts and the examples where you've been building up that evidence base. It will identify for you where you've built up some strong evidence, but also where you may have some gaps, where you might need to go back. This is your document, and other than having uploaded it for your online tutor to review specific space, it is not submitted. So it's your notes, but if you build your evidence as you go along in this way using the tracker, then when you come to your final submission, you can see how you can make use of that evidence to formulate your submission and using the prompts to really support that. These next two slides look at the challenging assessment criteria. Again, this is from the latest round of assessment and moderation. Criteria that you've got on the next two slides were identified as the most challenging to candidates. It is interesting to note that significantly these more challenging criteria are analytical and evaluative based, and this is something that you need to address and specifically focus on when you're writing up your submissions. So again, I would suggest you look at that glossary and make sure you're really analysing and evaluating according to what they are looking for. So here are the analysis and evaluation definitions. Analysis is the process of studying the detail, the structure, and the patterns in a range of information or data. Where this includes international research, you are looking closely at what is being said by a range of sources about a particular topic, making sure you can identify the similarities and differences between them, recognizing the part different contexts play in the theory or research being described. Evaluation is the process of judging the importance or value of the sources or research for your particular context or study. How valid is the research? How useful is it to you? How does it impact on your study? Does it give you new insights to your own schools or organisation? How might you use the theory or research in shaping your project? So just consider those two definitions and have a look at the mark scheme as well. So without going through each of these, you can see in green what people did not do as effectively. And use this again as an aid memoir when you're writing up your submission to make sure you are tackling those green aspects and that you're making sure you do put evidence in. For example, where it says people omit to write approaches to curriculum development. Make sure that you're considering the different approaches. Or where you're not thinking about communication campaigns and techniques used by other schools, thinking about that while you're building up your evidence base. It might be useful to highlight some of those on your tracker to make sure you're covering those as you're building your evidence base up. And here's the second slide. So there's quite a lot that haven't been as well completed, for want of a better way of putting it, as perhaps some of the others. So you can see on the business case, you don't include management costs, and remember that costs can be time costs. They don't always have to be financial costs. So using people's time in a different way may make things more efficient without actually having a monetary cost and an amount of money you can put on it, but it could be a cost in the amount of hours or days that you're saving. Remember things like where it says analyze key research into an examples of effective professional development. Remember, when you go back into your online learning and your online learning courses, then you will find some research into effective professional development, and it's also referenced within some of the tasks that you're doing, as well as the pages of content, and you're able to go back into that course to have a look at some of that research if you haven't recorded it as you've gone along. Okay. The next section is about the role of your sponsor and the importance of the role of your sponsor. So this is just a reminder, and I know we've kind of covered this when we've done other things, and on face-to-face days we've looked at the sponsor role. So your sponsor role is to provide gradings and comments on the submission form. They grade against each of the separate sections, and they also are able to provide additional comments on the submission form. What they must provide evidence for as a minimum are criterion 3.2.1 and 4.2.1, which, as it says, is a separate template which you can find on the Learning Network. That last bullet point, I would stress that you do need to have worked closely with your sponsor. They do need to have a really good understanding of your work, how that relates to the 6 content areas and the assessment criteria. And again, using the project tracker and having those regular meetings with your sponsor so they can see how you're building the evidence and what those criterion look like will be really important when it comes to that final submission form. The sponsor is required to grade you 1 to 4. 1 is high against each content area of your submission, and you can see the gradings here on this slide. And as it says, your sponsor may not remember or be aware of everything that you have done, so having those ongoing meetings is important. The grade is an overall score for the content area. They need to score each of the content areas for the assessment submission. So each of those 6 content areas they need to assess into. Where a specific criterion is not as in-depth or is weaker than other criteria, then your sponsor can be encouraged to insert an additional comment aligned to that criterion, using keywords from it to scaffold the points that are made. So having that ongoing dialogue is key. This next slide looks at the characteristic of strong sponsor practice. You cannot underestimate the role your sponsor will play in the assessment decision about your leadership and gaining the qualification. So just to reiterate, I do hope that you're meeting regularly with your sponsor and that you've used that project tracker that has all the criteria identified within each of the content areas. If you use this checklist and over the course of the year to have a powerful conversation, then you've got that leadership and the application of your leadership tracked as part of that reflective dialogue. And your sponsor will have a clear idea about how you've been developing your leadership and the impact that it's been having. Where appropriate, encourage the sponsor to write specific comments aligned to individual criteria to support your submission. Remember, sponsor comments and additional evidence are not included in the word count. Do ensure your sponsor additional evidence form for 3.2.1 and 4.2.1, which is a required additional sheet, is specifically aligned to the language and keywords taken from the criterion. Ensure you also include a short reflective evaluation about the way in which you need to adapt and tailor your leadership style to lead effectively in different contexts for your project. So this next slide looks at 3.2.1 and 4.2.1, and they are the 2 mark aspects of each of those criterion. Your sponsor is writing to these, so to assist that, you are able to draft those documents for them so that they are making sure that they have sufficient detail in them to address all the aspects of the assessment criteria. Your sponsor then can amend that document accordingly, so you can support your sponsor in drafting those. Get your sponsors to use the language of the assessment criteria and make sure they're looking at those 2 marks aspects so that you're aiming to fulfill the 2 marks aspect. So they can make an accurate assessment towards that 2 marks. Okay. So this is an example to look at how somebody has put their evidence together for 4.2.1. You can see that the phrases are highlighted in bold and that these are helpful to an assessor, because you can see that they have looked at seeking out the views of staff and pupils, that it's linked to the planning of the improvement priority, and look at how they are maintaining effective working partnerships in terms of supporting colleagues and how they've been challenged to do that. So you can see the key words, the key phrases in there that are linked to the 2 marks and the criterion that were on the previous slide. Finally, the final session is just to run through the actual submission and the process for you. So these are the documentation requirements. Remember, you are leading an improvement project across the school and you have 5,000 words. Your assessment submission is on the pro forma, so you need to make sure that you are pulling down the correct documents from the learning network. Check you've got all the supporting and additional documents and that you have not inserted those into the main narrative of your submission, but they are separate documents, separate and submitted as separate attachments. When selecting your additional supporting documents, ensure there are significant ones that can be tracked to additional or specific assessment criteria and that they offer key evidence of your effective leadership. So in addition to your submission pro forma, you can see from the slide that you have got to put those required supporting documents in, which is quite a lot, so 6 additional documents, but again, they don't count towards the 5,000 words. And then you are entitled to put up to 2 more additional supporting documents in. You do not have to, but some people do if it supports areas or specific criteria. Then to submit your work, this is fairly self-explanatory. You choose your window and then you will be uploading it. And guidance out on how to do that is on the Learning Network, as it says. So have a look at that. There's also guidance within the assessment handbook. Before uploading your submission, please do make sure that you are labeling your documents, each of your documents, in the way that it shows on the slides. Do a quick check to make sure you've got all the relevant documents, because you don't want to be in a position where you've not got a document and therefore the evidence is missing for that particular assessment criterion. And then the windows are found on the Learning Network. Make sure that you make a note of these dates at the beginning of the programme. So you can find those on the syllabus page, you can find them on the assessment page. As it says there, you have an option to complete and submit after 12 or 15 months. We do advise that you try and complete within the 15 months. However, there are circumstances when that isn't possible, and there are additional window at approximately 18 months. And as it says there, then you would apply for that because of the circumstances. So you're aiming for that 15-month window. You are asked to give an indicator of when you're planning on submitting via a survey, and if you intend to submit in that window. And finally, why do some people do better than others? And that's a fairly self-explanatory slide, and just reiterates what we've said earlier on in this briefing. They read the assessment criteria. They really understand them, respond equally to each. Make sure that you have an active leadership role, not passive. Remember, you're leading that project. You've referenced your research, which is relevant, and you've shown how you've applied it and what impact it's had. And you are providing evidence, not assertions. So I wish you all the very best as you go through your journey towards this final assessment. And if you do have any final questions that you're still unsure about, then the email at the end is the best route to make sure that they can answer anything that might be outstanding. Okay, thank you.